Story 2. Shadows of Chernobyl. Witnesses of the disaster. After an intensive stay in Kyiv, Stanley decides to continue his journey, delving deeper into those places that have become a symbol of the tragic history of Ukraine. The choice falls on the exclusion zone of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. He sets off early in the morning, when Kyiv is still shrouded in fog, and thoughts about the past and the future are intertwined in his head. Stanley was sitting in an old bus that was slowly making its way through the foggy countryside. Here it is, Pripyat, a ghost town known for its tragic past. The journalist's heart began to beat faster when the bus stopped at the edge of this abandoned world. Outside the window, through a light fog, he saw ruined buildings, the once bright colors of which had long lost their saturation, and now merged with the dark and dull nature. When Stanley got off the bus, he was hit by a wind filled with the smell of dampness and decay. It felt as if the very air of this place kept the memory of that disaster. The guide, Alexei, a man in his 50s with a haggard face, greeted him with a warm smile that didn't seem to match the general atmosphere around him. Alexei was once a resident of Pripyat, but now he returned here as a guide to help others understand the tragedy and prevent similar incidents in the future. "Welcome to Pripyat," said Alexei, beckoning Stanley to follow him. They started walking around the city, and the first thing that struck the journalist was absolute silence. No children's laughter, no sounds of cars, not even the chirping of birds, only the dull rustle of leaves that the wind lifted from the broken sidewalks. They passed by the building of the old kindergarten, where children's voices once rang. Alexei stopped, and his look was filled with sadness. "This is where I took my daughter," he said, leading Stanley to the broken window. Inside, you could see abandoned cots and toys covered in a thick layer of dust. "That was her favorite bunny," he added, pointing to an old stuffed toy lying among the trash. Time seemed to stand still. Stanley tried to imagine how this place looked before the disaster. Bright colors, children laughing, flowering trees in the streets. But the reality of the destroyed city reminded itself again. The walls of the houses were covered with cracks, the balconies were hanging by a thread, and the glass from the windows had long been knocked out, leaving the buildings bare and defenseless against nature. "We often went for walks in the park," continued Alexei, pointing with his hand to a forest area overgrown with thick trees and bushes. "It was once an amusement park with a Ferris wheel and rides, but now it has become part of the wild nature that has gradually absorbed everything human. The trees here grew so dense that the sun's rays barely penetrated through their leaves." When they reached the central square of the city, Stanley was struck by the feeling of emptiness. Here, where once life was raging, now there was only silence. "It was the heart of Pripyat," said Alexei. "We used to meet friends here, spend holidays here, and now it's just a memory." His words hung in the air like an echo of the past. Stanley stopped to take a few pictures, but with each frame he felt the weight of the place more and more. The camera could not convey what he saw and felt. This walk was not only a physical journey through the city, but also an immersion in history, in the life that was once here and that will never return. Leaving the square behind, they approached one of the high-rise buildings where, according to Alexei, his family once lived. This building has become a symbol of an abandoned city, with dark windows looking at the world with empty eyes. "This was our apartment." Alexei pointed to one of the windows on the 3rd floor. "From here I saw the first signs of disaster." Stanley couldn't help but notice the sadness in Alexei's eyes as he remembered those terrible moments. He realized that this journey would be difficult not only for him as a journalist, but also for those who agreed to share their stories, opening their souls to him and the whole world. Alexei invited him to go up to the apartment where the happiest moments of his life had once taken place. But now all that remained were memories and the shadow of the disaster. Stanley was standing in an abandoned apartment on one of the upper floors of a high-rise that had once been the guide's home. The windows were boarded up, but a soft light filtered through the cracks. The guide, standing by the window, silently looked at the empty yard where children used to play. He began to talk about that day, April 26, 1986. "I was awakened early in the morning by an unusual hum," he began. "The sky was illuminated by an inexplicable light, and tension was felt in the air. We didn't know what had happened, but after a few hours the news about the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant spread around the city. Fear began to grip us when we realized that the situation was much more serious than it seemed at first glance. The guide described how the city gradually sank into chaos. People tried to find information, but the truth remained hidden. Everyone lived in uncertainty, not knowing what was next for their city and their lives. Stanley listened intently as the guide talked about the evacuation that took place 2 days after the accident. People were told they were only leaving the city for 3 days, but those who boarded the buses never returned home. The evacuation was organized quickly, but fear and uncertainty were in the air. We left everything, the guide recalled. Photos, favorite things, our homes. I remember my son crying, not understanding why we were leaving our home. We tried to calm the children, but we were in shock ourselves. The buses took us further and further, and with each mile we realized that there might be no going back. Stanley imagined that day, multitudes of people leaving their homes, not knowing they would never return. It was a farewell to the life they had known and to the dreams that had remained in the past. The guide continued his story, recalling how the dreams of the residents of Pripyat were shattered in one moment. Young people, who were just starting to build their future, suddenly found themselves without a home, without plans for tomorrow. The city, which was a symbol of progress and hope, became an area that had to be abandoned, forgotten and erased from memory as soon as possible. My wife dreamed of a garden near our house, the guide said painfully. We were planning to plant trees, arrange a playground for our son. But these dreams never came true. Now only weeds grow in this place, and this place will always remain a wasteland in our hearts. Stanley felt a deep sadness for those people whose lives had been destroyed, whose dreams had been erased, and whose futures had become unpredictable and frightening. It was difficult to understand the scale of the disaster and its consequences for those who survived these events. The guide told how difficult it was to learn the truth about radiation and its effects on health. The information that reached people was often contradictory, and the fear of the unknown increased. We were told that everything was under control, the guide said, but we knew it was not true. People began to get sick, many moved away from these places, but for many it was already too late. We became victims of our own trust in the system that betrayed us. Stanley felt outraged for those who suffered from false promises and lack of proper information. He understood how important the truth is, especially in such critical situations. Stanley took the time to wander the deserted streets of Pripyat on his own. He could only hear his footsteps and the wind blowing through the ruined buildings. This city seemed frozen in time, frozen in that terrible moment when everything changed. On one of the streets, he stopped near an old school. Children's drawings still hung on the walls, empty desks remained in the classrooms, and abandoned notebooks lay on the floor. Stanley felt the presence of those who had once studied here, their hopes and dreams that remained here forever. This city speaks, he thought. It preserves the voices of those who once lived here, even if they are no longer there. These are voices from the silence that need to be heard. Stanley stopped for the night at a small tourist hotel near the exclusion zone. It was an old, unassuming house with peeling paint on the walls and creaky wooden floors. All the furniture was reminiscent of Soviet times. Heavy wooden cabinets, beds with metal backs, thin mattresses and faded blankets. The hotel was dark and silent, as if captured by the burden of the history that the area held. The night came quickly. She brought with her a heavy gloom in which time seemed to stand still. Stanley sat by the window of his room, watching the moon slowly rise above the horizon, illuminating the empty fields that spread out around the hotel. His thoughts went back to everything he had learned that day. He felt how the city, destroyed by the accident, seemed to extend its shadows to him, not allowing him to forget what he had seen and heard. The silence around was almost oppressive, only occasionally broken by the sounds of the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. All this created an atmosphere of tension and anxiety, which grew with every minute. Stanley tried to sleep, but the thoughts of those fates that remained here forever did not give him peace. Around midnight, Stanley was awakened by an inexplicable sound. He listened carefully, hoping it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. However, the sound repeated itself, a soft whisper that came from somewhere below. The journalist decided to check what it could be and, putting on his jacket, slowly left the room. He walked down the dark corridor, listening to the sounds that now sounded more clearly. Stanley made his way down to the first floor, where there was a small room furnished with a few armchairs and an old television. Moonlight penetrated through the narrow window, creating strange shadows on the walls. He went to the window where he heard the same whisper that now seemed very close. Stanley stopped, listened, and realized that it was not just a whisper, but a voice that said something incomprehensible. It's impossible, he thought, but a chill ran down his spine. The voice continued as if telling a story that needed to be heard. Stanley felt his heart begin to beat faster. He tried to understand what exactly the voice was saying, but the words were indecipherable, like distant echoes lost in the spaces of time. Suddenly, the voice stopped, leaving behind a heavy silence. Stanley stood motionless, feeling the weight of that night press against his chest. He could not understand exactly what was happening, but he knew that Chernobyl and Pripyat would not let him go so easily. These places kept their secret, and he was only at the beginning of his journey to its solution. Stanley returned to his room, but no more sleep came. He pondered what this mysterious voice could mean, and why he felt such a deep connection to a place he had never been before. It was more than just a professional interest. It was something personal, something that bothered him. In the morning, when the first rays of the sun broke through the clouds, Stanley knew that he had to continue his research. He had to find the answer to all the questions that arose that night. What happened in Pripyat not only on a physical level but also on a spiritual level? Were these places just a reminder of the tragedy, or did they become a gateway to something bigger, deeper? Leaving the hotel, Stanley again set off for the exclusion zone. Now he was interested not only in what he would see and learn from eyewitnesses, but also in what was hidden behind visible events. He needed to find those shadows that were kept in Chernobyl and understand their true meaning. He was certain that this was only the beginning of his great investigation, and that the answer he sought was somewhere out there, among the ruined buildings and silent shadows that enveloped the place. Stanley returned to Pripyat with a new sense of anxiety. The guide he had met earlier was waiting for him on the street near one of the abandoned buildings. The guide invited Stanley to his old apartment, which was miraculously saved from looting. The apartment seemed frozen in time. Furniture left in its place, old photos on the walls, books still lying on the shelves. "This was our home," the guide said quietly. "We celebrated the new year here. We brought our son here from the maternity hospital. Every corner of this apartment is filled with memories." Stanley listened intently as the tour guide mentioned his neighbors and friends who lived in this house. Most of them have already died, many from radiation, some from the depression that overtook them after the evacuation. All of them remained in the memory of this apartment, left their traces, their dreams, which never came true. The guide told how people tried to live on after the disaster, but were constantly faced with a difficult reality. They couldn't go home, but they couldn't forget him either. It was a wound that remained open for years, and which even new beginnings could not heal. Stanley went to the local kindergarten, which stood abandoned in the middle of a dense forest, which quickly absorbed everything around it. The ruined building, overgrown with ivy, looked almost like a part of nature. Stanley felt a deep sadness when he saw the children's toys left in their places, as if the children were about to return to play. This place is a symbol of what we have lost, he thought. Generations that could have lived, loved, created, remained here like these forgotten toys. He walked around the classrooms, observing the chalkboards that still had traces of chalk on them. Images of children who laughed and played here were born in my head. But now there was only silence, which reminded of the tragedy that had happened. Stanley imagined how these children would have grown up, how they could have changed the world, had it not been for the disaster that changed their destinies forever. Stanley felt he had to get these stories out into the world so that people would remember what happened. The lost generations must live in the memory of those who know their stories. After visiting the kindergarten, Stanley headed to one of the most famous symbols of Pripyat, an abandoned amusement park. The Ferris wheel, which had never worked, now stood as a silent witness to a vanished city. Stanley moved closer to the symbol, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and admiration. The guide who accompanied him told how this park was supposed to open a few days after the accident. It was supposed to be a place of joy and fun for children and adults, but instead it became one of the most terrible symbols of tragedy. Now darkness reigned here, and only the echoes of the past reminded of those plans that never came to fruition. "These walls keep silent stories," said the guide. "They remember all the hopes and dreams that disappeared with the radiation explosion. Now they remind us of what was lost forever." Stanley took some photos to preserve these moments. He knew that his story should include not only the facts, but also these feelings that he was currently experiencing. This place was a living witness to how quickly all our dreams can disappear. Stanley met with a group of young people who had grown up after the disaster, but who felt a deep connection to the tragedy. They were the children of those who survived the evacuation, but they did not see their homes. Their understanding of the tragedy was based on the stories of their parents and the stories they had heard all their lives. "We knew from childhood that our parents left something important in the past," said one of the girls. "It was a part of their lives that they could never forget. And we grew up with this sense of loss, even though we didn't know exactly what it meant." Stanley listened to how young people talked about their feelings, how they tried to understand and make sense of what happened. They talked about their efforts to reconnect with a place they had never been to, but which had an impact on their lives. "We must preserve the memory of this place," said the girl. "This is our responsibility to those who suffered. We cannot allow these stories to be forgotten." Stanley felt deep respect for these young people who carried the memory of Chernobyl across generations. Their determination to preserve these stories gave him strength in his mission. Stanley was struck by the power of nature, which gradually began to restore the exclusion zone. Trees, bushes, and grass have taken over streets, buildings, and even once carefully manicured parks. He watched as the forest engulfed the city, making it part of the natural landscape. Nature has a story here, Stanley thought. She not only restores herself, but also hides what remains from the past. The guide said that over time various animals appeared, including wolves, deer, and even Przewalski's horses. Nature seems to have found a way to restore balance, even in such harsh conditions. But this recovery was a reminder that a place that was once home to thousands of people is now home to wildlife. Stanley realized that nature doesn't forget, it just adapts. It hides what was, but does not erase it completely. It was a symbol of survival, but also of oblivion that replaced the human presence. Stanley decided to visit one of the most dangerous areas, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant itself. He drove up to the giant sarcophagus that covers the remains of the reactor that exploded that terrible day. Here, next to the epicenter of the disaster, he felt the full weight of the events that had taken place. He was accompanied by an engineer who worked at the station before the accident and survived. The engineer talked about how he and his colleagues fought the consequences of the explosion, risking their lives to save others. He recalled the fear and despair that gripped them in those days, but also the courage they found within themselves. "We knew we might not come back," said the engineer, "but we couldn't just leave this place. We were part of this station, and we had to do everything we could to stop the disaster." Stanley felt a deep respect for these people who risked their lives for others. He realized that true heroes don't always receive awards, but their stories must be told. After completing his tour of the exclusion zone, Stanley stopped at the edge of Pripyat, looking back at the city that has become a symbol of human error and nature's recovery. He felt that he had visited a place that cannot be forgotten, and that should serve as a reminder to all generations of what happened. Stanley knew his stories wouldn't change the past, but they could help people understand the importance of preserving memory. He felt that these stories needed to be heard so that a similar disaster would never happen again. Chernobyl is not just a place, he thought. This is a lesson that humanity must learn. With these thoughts, Stanley left the exclusion zone, but felt that a part of his soul remained there, among those silent shadows that continued to live in Chernobyl. After Stanley left Pripyat and returned to his temporary home, He realized he needed to dig deeper into how the disaster affected people far beyond the exclusion zone. He decided to meet with representatives of the generation that was born after the accident, but still feels its consequences. The next morning, Stanley met Olga, a young woman born in 1990, 4 years after the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. She was one of those whose childhood was spent in constant fear of radiation. Her parents were evacuated from Pripyat and tried to create a new life in another city. But Chernobyl left its mark on their worldview and, accordingly, on Olga's upbringing. Stanley was sitting in a small cafe in Kyiv, watching as Olga, wringing her hands nervously, tried to find the words to describe her childhood. She admitted that she felt like she was forever being watched by some invisible force that constantly reminded her that the world was not a safe place. "My father often talked about how important it is to be careful," Olga said. "He always emphasized that we cannot know where danger is waiting for us. He talked about radiation, but really it was about our whole life." Stanley listened intently as Olga described the fears that haunted her family after the accident. They tried to build a new life, but always lived with the feeling that something could go wrong. This fear was also transmitted to Olga, affecting her outlook and life decisions. "My mother always said that we should remember the past so as not to repeat its mistakes," Olga said. "But this past became a burden for us that we could not get rid of. It was always there, like a shadow." Stanley realized that the legacy of Chernobyl included not only physical effects, but also a profound psychological impact on those living with its effects. People born after the disaster carried the burden of the past, which affected their present and future. Olga told how over the years she learned to live with this burden, but the fears that were laid down in childhood remained with her. She dreamed of freeing herself from these fears, but she knew it would be difficult to do. Olga became the embodiment of how a disaster can affect generations who were not direct witnesses of the events, but still bear their burden. After speaking with Olga, Stanley felt that this story should be told not only as a warning, but also as an example of how the past can continue to affect people's lives. He realized that the legacy of Chernobyl was much deeper than he had imagined, and that its effects continued to live on in the souls of those trying to build their future in a world that had changed forever. After meeting with Olga, Stanley decided to return to the exclusion zone. This time he visited places that were less known, but had their own special meaning. One such place was an abandoned village near Pripyat, where several dozen families once lived. Now this village was almost completely absorbed by nature, leaving behind only destroyed buildings and a silence reminiscent of the loud screams and panic of the evacuation day. Walking through the ruined streets, Stanley couldn't help but feel a deep sadness. He stopped by one of the abandoned houses and tried to imagine how life was before the disaster. As children played in the yard, as adults worked in the garden, as families gathered together for dinner. But now all this was destroyed irrevocably. The houses were empty, the windows were broken, the doors were open, as if someone had fled in a great hurry. Stanley got closer to one of the houses and saw an old toy left on the floor in the hallway. It was a small doll that seemed to be waiting for its owner who would never return. Stanley felt this silence literally scream of lost lives, of shattered dreams, of destinies that had changed so suddenly. Silence became a symbol of what happened in Chernobyl, and it continued to haunt those who were forced to leave their homes. In that moment, Stanley realized that you don't always have to hear words to feel pain and loss. Sometimes silence speaks volumes. He felt that this loud silence that reigned in the exclusion zone should be communicated to the world. She was a reminder of what happened and that such tragedies should not happen again. Stanley also met with a man who worked in the exclusion zone after the disaster, doing one of the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs, decontamination of the area. Mykola was one of the many who voluntarily set out to fight the consequences of the accident, not fully realizing the risks it posed for his life. Mykola told Stanley about his work removing contaminated soil, washing the walls of buildings, and even burying equipment that was contaminated with radiation. He talked about how he worked without proper protective equipment because there was simply none. These people did their work without receiving any recognition, and often with no hope that their efforts would ever be appreciated. "We did it because it had to be done," Mykola said. We did not think about awards or that someone would praise us. We just did what we thought was necessary. Stanley was struck by this simplicity and at the same time the depth of human courage. He realized that these unsung heroes, people who did their jobs without waiting for recognition, deserved their stories to be told. These were the people thanks to whom many others could go on with their lives, without even knowing the sacrifices that were made for their safety. Continuing his research, Stanley met with a scientist who was studying the myths and rumors that arose around the Chernobyl disaster. In particular, he talked about how the fear of the unknown gave rise to various legends about mutants, ghosts and curses that allegedly haunt those who dare to visit the exclusion zone. This scientist explained to Stanley that such myths often arise in situations where people do not have enough information and try to fill the gaps in knowledge with their own ideas and fears. This is how stories are born about mutated animals or about the spirits of the dead who wander around the area, looking for peace. Stanley was interested in uncovering the truth, but at the same time he understood that these myths are part of the legacy of Chernobyl, part of the deep mystery that surrounds the place. They not only reflect people's fears, but also show how the disaster continues to affect the minds and hearts of many, even decades after the event. After a long stay in the exclusion zone, Stanley returned to Kyiv, but Chernobyl left a deep mark on his mind. He felt that this place made him rethink many things in his life. Shadows of Chernobyl haunted him even after he left the exclusion zone. In Kyiv, Stanley met with his colleague, who also visited the exclusion zone and who helped him summarize all his impressions and thoughts. They discussed for a long time how Chernobyl affected their work and their lives in general. It was a moment when Stanley felt that his story was coming to an end, but at the same time he realized that Chernobyl would always remain a part of his life. Realizing this, Stanley decided that his next step should be to talk about Chernobyl to the world, show its true face and help others understand what happened and what it means for the future. He knew that this story was only the beginning, and that he still had a lot of important work ahead of him. If you are interested in stories, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss interesting stories from Storytelling World.